Welcome to Up Close, Meet the Poet Behind the Verse. I am your speaker, I'm your host, River Maria Urke. And here to help me pull this off is a mutual poet, Julie Martin.
Hello.
Up Close showcases a new poet each month with an interview, a poetry reading, and a giveaway. Our goal is to introduce the person behind the poems. With that, first I have to deal with some housekeeping stuff. I'd like to ask our Zoom audience to please remain muted during the duration of the show, and that we encourage audience questions. You can put them in the chat. And we also support our authors with giveaways that we'll have details later. And today in the email, we'll have, in the link in the chat, we'll have a link that'll go to where you can sign up for our email list and get a invite in your mailbox every month. So, but with that, I have to give a shout out to our sponsors, the League of Minnesota Poets, and then remind us all we're live on Facebook. And with that, I would like you to sit back and I would introduce to you our December Up Close poet, Lina Belar.
Hi, River.
Hello. Give me just a minute and I'm going to introduce you.
Oh.
Lina is a native of the East Coast. She grew up in New Jersey in the 1950s and lived in New York City for a decade before moving west. Back then, Lina and her girlfriends enjoyed browsing the United Farm catalog for real estate and farmland, looking for places to move. The prices and size of land and house were so different compared to New York. In 1974, Lina, her husband and son, moved to Perham, Minnesota, a town of roughly 3,000 people. She was 30 years old. For the next 40 years, Lina worked the most interesting array of jobs I've come across yet. Currently, she lives in Wadena, Minnesota, and is the executive director of the Wadena County Historical Society. Her son and 18-year-old grandson live in a nearby town. Lina is a poet, historian, musician, and narrative writer. She has written about topics ranging from giant pumpkins to veteran stories. Her poetry has been featured in Talking Stick, Lake Region Review, and Northern Lights Library Network's Poets Across Minnesota. Currently, she is working on a project, More Poems of Hope and Reassurance. We will learn about a little later. Without further ado, let us welcome Lina Belar. Good day, dear.
Hi, River. Thanks for having me here.
Definitely. Well, let's begin with the giveaway details. So
Okay.
you're gonna give away 2 books tonight, right?
Yeah.
So we play a number game, and the numbers range from 1 to 50, and whoever comes the closest to one of the numbers and doesn't go over will be the winner. And each audience member in Zoom has one guess that they can put in the chat, and that at the end of the show we'll announce the winners. So what is the book you're going to give away?
My first and so far only chapbook is called Rural Score. I didn't realize how hard it was to pronounce that word until I had already printed it, had it printed, but
yeah, it's sometimes hard to know that stuff. Well, that happens to lead us right into our interview, because the first question has to do with 15 years ago, you decided to become serious about writing poetry. I mean, you've written poetry for a while, but you decided you challenged yourself. And your book, Rural Score, is the product of your personal challenge. So what I want to ask is, what was that challenge?
That challenge was that I was going to read a poem every day at least a poem every day. And I was going to write a poem every week. And I did that pretty faithfully for many years. And at the end of that time, I had enough poems to really look at them and study them and see if they're worth keeping. And
And
so
you put it,
that was the basics. For, it was several years, but that was the basis for the poems in the book. And then I had a few left over that I could start a new book with. And then I continued doing that process. Probably up until just a few years ago, when things, when the pandemic interrupted a whole lot of
yeah.
things.
Well, we'll get to that in a little bit, but how did writing and reading the poetry make you feel?
Well, it sort of depends on the poem. I mean, reading it.
You had mentioned to me before that doing that studying and reading different people and writing it brought a different part to your life that you didn't have. I wish I could remember, but
I enjoyed reading the poems, and you know, I started out reading an anthology of a lot of poems, and then as I went on, I would pick particular poets that I really liked, and I would keep reading and keep reading. I don't like to just read a poem at once. I like to read it 50 or 60 times eventually, and then I begin to get more about it. And then how did I like writing my poems? At first, I think it was hard to actually express what I wanted to express well. But when I got done with them, I felt like I had created friends that would be with me for life. So it was kind of fun. I like that part of it.
That's what I was remembering.
Okay.
Well, do you have a poem from the book that you like to read to us?
I could give you one here. This is called Rural Score. Beneath a sagging canopy of an abandoned gas station, 24 6-foot hollyhocks stand guard like weary sentries. Chamomile, tucked in cracked cement, releases sweet fragrance with each step. Across the highway, seagulls follow furrows left by a tractor that turns the earth, leaving black lines dotted with white birds, a kind of sheet music for the land. A short one.
That's nice. Well, maybe we'll come back to the book in a little bit, but first, well, you've been a narrative writer for the last 35 plus years.
Yeah, I've always written, whether I was writing just my daily jottings or whether I was writing for work or something like that. A lot of and I started probably about 30 or 40 years ago, writing for magazines, articles, doing technical writing and things like that. I was in the greenhouse business for a long time, and so when I stopped doing that, I started writing about it, how to grow greenhouse tomatoes and cucumbers and things like
that. One that stands out to me is when you had a radio job and you had a lesson you learned for writing for the radio that taught you something about poetry.
Well, it did. That was later in my life. That was actually when I had already decided I was going to be a poet. I took this, or I was offered this job of writing for the radio. And at first I didn't know how to do it at all, because it was a little different than writing 2,500 words for a magazine. And so I realized, well, what I'm learning then is I'm really learning how to write poetry, because there you have to be very, you have to really be very deliberate about your words, because you can't use a lot of them. And
you'd have to be very precise.
Yeah, I think that's true for poetry, and it's also true for writing on the radio, because you only have a 30 seconds to get your message across.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's you wrote a lot for press releases and grants and articles.
Yep.
You did but one job that's really fascinating, I really wanted to ask you about this one, is when you actually moved to Minnesota in 74. You said you had a liberal arts degree and there was not much to do, so you fell back on a trade that your father taught you that was very rare for a woman to work in. And so I'm curious what it was like to be a woman working in construction in Minnesota in 1974.
Okay, yeah. My training was liberal arts. I didn't have a degree, but that's all I had ever studied. And when I got to Minnesota, I realized that that wasn't going to do me much good getting a job. But I always worked with my dad, who liked doing construction things and like repairing things. And so I like to do that. I like working with my hands. I like figuring out problems. And so I started doing that. And I started in the bottom of the trades, which was slinging mud or carrying blocks for people who were laying blocks for basements, that kind of thing. And fortunately, that didn't last much longer than a summer. Then I knew a little bit more about the trades, and I could get a little better job than that. And I worked one summer with a plumber as a plumber's assistant. And that's a time where I probably met more people that were surprised to find a woman in the trade. Um, but it was interesting because at first they would look a little surprised or a little askance that I was doing it. But then after a while, if I did the job, that's all they thought about. And I found that very refreshing because, as you know, there's a certain amount of sexism in the employment industry. and, and most of the time it's not very overt. And it was really nice in the construction trade to encounter head on and confront it, and that it didn't matter anymore.
That is.
The only time that was sometimes come up is that they would be talking pretty familiarly and slang language, as construction workers probably do the world over. And once in a while, somebody'd look up and would see me there, and they go, "Oh, excuse me," and I'd say, "Don't worry, I'm from New York."
That's funny. That brings another job that I found interesting. I love antiques myself, but that you and your husband had an antique store from 90 to, I don't remember when you stopped. It was a couple, yeah,
Well, actually,
2000 something.
it was my husband that wanted to have an antique store. He's always wanted that, and I had just finished working in the greenhouse and working construction, and so I decided to help him. And I loved studying about the antiques. That was the most interesting thing for me. And so we had a deal that I would learn all the glassware and he would learn everything else. And that's about equal because there's an awful lot of glassware that's in the antique business. And it's very popular at that time. We had a consignment shop, and so we used it sort of as a way to learn the business by having people bring in stuff that they know what it's worth, and so it was easy to do that. And then when I started working with the museum, and that was becoming more of a full-time job, he quit his job, his regular job, and he took over the antique shop. So that was really great.
Well, and that leads us into how buckets did you start a museum, and how did that come to be? And how does it relate to your job today?
Well, it came to be because I used to go to the library every day to use their computer. This is back in the 80s. And the library was at the, I've been a big fan of libraries all my life, and trying to, I worked on their boards and helped them out and the volunteer and stuff like that. And the library was looking at a building project. They were going to move from this beautiful church that they'd been using for since 1910 or something like that, and they were going to build a building right next to it. And everybody kept saying, "Well, what are you going to do with that beautiful building?" And I said, "Well, I could write a business plan for you. You know, you could take it to the city and see if they would be interested in doing something about it." And so I did. They had a small historical society. I wrote that for them. We took it to the city, and the city said, "Oh, that's a good idea. We could do this." And so the next question was, "Well, now who's going to make this museum?" And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about museums, but I can learn."
Hmm.
And at that time, the Minnesota Historical Society had a field rep that would travel the state. He probably put on thousands of miles a month. Just he'd go to every little town that had any kind of museum, no matter how big, how small, and he'd help them, learn ways to do things better. Um, and he was just a wealth of knowledge, and he really encouraged me. And and his big advice was, "Well, you should just go look at other museums, and you should see what you do." So I would do it. I would go look at these other museums, and then I'd come back and I say, "Well," his name was Dave Nystuen. I said, "Dave, but these are great, but they have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to make this beauty." And he go, "Oh, don't worry. We need to spend a lot of money on these things because we have so many people on staff, but you can find volunteers to do it." So he wasn't put off by that excuse. And so that's what I did. I found volunteers who could do things, ways that I could do it, but I tried to always follow his advice, which was tell the story and tell it successfully so that people will want to know more about it.
And then today you work for the Historical Society.
So then, the first museum I built or created was out of this old church that the library was. We got some grants to remodel it, and upgrade it and stuff like that. And then we got some local support to all kinds of people. I met a person who was a collector of train everything, huge collection of Northern Pacific memorabilia. And remember, I had antique this background, so that helped a little. But with that, I could rotate. I made one exhibit that was just devoted to the railroad because that was a big deal. Because it was a railroad town. Perham was the railroad town, and I made it a rotating exhibit. So every couple of months, we'd have a new amount things from the railroads. It could be 1 month, it could be the lighting on the railroad. Another month, it would be about the dining cars on the railroad, stuff like that. And we had a few permanent exhibits. Another big thing in Perham was the hospital, and they had an early hospital. And we had one area that was devoted to all the stuff that had been collected from there. And I was working with a woman who had been a nurse, and she had, so I've been so lucky to meet people that knew these things and had these things, and so they put it together. So it was just they even the State Historical Society, they thought it was one of the best little museums because it was very little museum. And then while I was doing that, the VFW came to me, got some members, and they said, we want a museum too, but we don't just want guns and uniforms. So that was my second mission, was to create a museum that would actually tell the veteran stories. And so that opened about 2006. So quite a
That in the same, what town was that in?
that was in Perham too.
Oh,
It
it
was
was,
an
okay.
old the old original VFW building, and but then we raised quite a bit of money, so we were able to remodel it and create a very imposing looking structure, I think, and had really great exhibits. And my son was very good at audiovisual and all the technical things. And it's an entire museum that was just based on the oral histories of area veterans.
It's
So
really,
you would you would listen to dozens of people as you went through the museum just by their oral histories.
well, here, let me take one little break, little side thing on, because we got a lot of new people, and say that we're having we're doing a giveaway, and there are 2 books Lina is giving away tonight, and you can pick a number between 1 and 50, and you can put it in the chat. So that's, well, the next thing I was going to bring up was the first time you were published. You happened to be 6 years old.
I was 6 years old, and I wrote a poem about a robin in spring, and my mother sent it to the newspaper. So I guess that was my first published work.
Well, I would love to hear another poem. Can we hear another one from your book, or another one you have?
Okay. At this point. This is the first poem in my book. It's called Free Ticket. For a free ticket to anywhere in the 48 contiguous United States, Canada, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean, I wait at the airport for 3 more hours, drink bad coffee, read trashy novels, and think, this isn't so bad. I can waste this much time watching TV, washing clothes, or wearing out cheap tennis shoes in a game of volleyball. For a free ticket to anywhere, I have given up a seat on the noon flight and gained the rest of the afternoon to find a comfortable position on badly contoured seats in a waiting room, noisy with more impatient travelers. Busy executives flash electronic devices. Children with imported tans play musical chairs. Across from me, a beautiful girl caresses the cheek of a slouchy youth in olive drab, who scans the room as though to reassure himself that no one is watching. I'm glad for this delay, since it postpones the prospect of one more homecoming without your smile to welcome me. For a free ticket to anywhere, I've caused myself a little inconvenience, but in the end, I've gained the illusion that if I go to somewhere else, you might be there too. That was dedicated to my husband, who had died not too many years previously.
It's beautiful. We're gonna move to when you were working on your second book, the pandemic hit, and it seemed kind of irrelevant to continue, and you had an idea. You definitely knew, and you definitely knew how to write grants. I mean, you're very good at writing grants, and you started a project. What was that project, and what came?
Yes, so I wrote a grant to Springboard for the Arts, and I said they were asked for ideas that artists had, and my idea was to write, collect poems from other poets, and and do something. In fact, this is part of my grant. I said, this pandemic is probably the biggest emergency that the people of this community have ever experienced. And poetry has always been used as a tool for challenge, to point out a need for improvement, to decry a failing of society. But these times require poetry to show not what is wrong, but what is right, and what we may nurture if we have the words. So I created this program that the poets across the region could submit poems of reassurance and of love, of hope, and humor. And they could be for anyone, anywhere who is being affected by the coronavirus. They could be for their neighbors or their business down the street, but the main purpose would be to uplift the spirits of those who needed it. So many of these poems were displayed during the 5 months in 2020, this summertime at Green Island Poetry Walk in Wadena. And it was supported by the grant called Community Emergency Relief Fund, a partnership between Emergency Arts and Springboard for the Arts. And then as we continued with the pandemic, I realized that we needed more poems of hope and reassurance. And so I applied for a grant from the State Arts Board. And I received a Creative Support for Individuals grant for 2021.
And that's your current project?
That's the current project.
You still accepting poems, or are you done with that part?
I did ask, we had some really wonderful poets submitted, and one of them is Thomas R. Smith. He's a very well.
I know him. I live in the same town as him.
Yeah, and I asked him if I could read his poem, if you want to hear it.
Yeah, you can read his poem.
And he wrote a poem called "You'll Never Walk Alone." You remember that song from it sort of came back during the pandemic. And so he said, I think it scared me a little as a kid. The emotionality, the near religious gravity. I mostly heard storm and be afraid. I sensed that it was about something big. Now it's come around again in a 1963 version by Jerry and the Pacemakers that probably didn't get much play on our shores. So it sounds old yet fresh to my ears. That recording, in fact, was enlisted by the Dutch DJ Sander Hugendorn to comfort Europeans fearful and housebound as we are here in the States, broadcast simultaneously on March 20th on hundreds of radio stations from Finland to Romania, Luxembourg to Spain. And there's a new video of that old song that fits perfectly this moment of the pandemic. The video, which you really must see, features a couple dozen different people miming Jerry Marsden's vocal. Men and women, adults and children, some funny, but all of them sweet and profoundly moving as they throw themselves into their part of the lyric, letting some essential innocence and vulnerability, which we all feel so keenly now, shine through. My body gets sad having to hold itself at a distance from so many I love. Doesn't yours? These stand-ins with their serious working class faces throw their arms around each other, sway together as they sing in that old familiar warm way we've suddenly lost. The lonely have always known that touch is the true wealth. Wouldn't you give anything now just for a good hug?
What a great ending.
Yeah, that's a great.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and go to another area of creativity for you. And before the pandemic, you were playing music almost every night.
Yeah.
Where were you doing? And what? Like, okay, so I'll have to first say that I think you were what? How old were you? 5 when you started you learn the piano?
I started piano when I was 5. I begged my mother, please, because she was a piano teacher, and she finally let me start taking lessons when I was 5. and I never really stopped playing.
And then what was it, fourth grade or third grade?
Oh, well, in
Sure.
fourth grade, they had a habit of getting the musical students to start the violin.
Oh,
And
okay.
so I started the violin, but I did not like it because I couldn't play it well, and it sounded so painful to listen to it. I love the violin now. Hearing, professional violinists, it's beautiful, a beautiful
Yeah.
instrument, but it was not a beautiful instrument in the hands of a fourth grader. And so I begged it that I could join the band. And in my fifth grade, I think I was able to join the band, and I picked trumpet. And so I've been playing that ever since then.
So you played every night out.
About I played with two different orchestras. So that was two rehearsals a night. I also play with the church, a couple of churches, and direct a choir. So that was another rehearsal, and then there was a couple of bands that I was playing with too. So there was, probably almost
Oh,
every day there was something. There was something until it just stopped.
and
I
how
mean,
that must have been pretty intense.
it was a big
How did
show.
that feel? Yeah.
Yeah.
And for how long did it stop?
Well, I'm only just now getting back into playing with one of the orchestras. I did play this summer with a circus band. That's another one that I've done for fun.
In Florida, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, this summer I went to Baraboo, Wisconsin, where they have a circus museum there, and they had a meeting, and they had a band, so I played with them. That was fun. But I'm just starting with Heartland Symphony Orchestra, and we're having our first concert this weekend.
Cool. That's got to be a great feeling to be starting when we're doing that every night.
Yeah, but that was, I don't, I don't play cards. I don't drink. I don't. I don't
Yep.
go out carousing, but I love to play music. So that's my entertainment. That's my socialization.
And you love to go on vacation down to your sisters in Florida.
I love to do that. I love to see her, and I'm going to go see her for Christmas this year because we didn't get together at all last year. Um, but this year I don't have any jobs that I have to play over Christmas. So we're going to go have Christmas together for the first time in 20 or 30 years. So that'll
Uh,
be really special. Yeah.
um, and then you're gonna have your winter vacation. And when you're
That'll
on
be my winter vacation.
when you're on vacation, you have a certain writing process that you do
I
compared
love
to
to
rather.
write. I like to work, period. And so I'll keep working even while I'm on vacation. But I'll particularly do things that require a little bit more quiet time. That I can, like now I have a proposal that I want to have done by the end of the year. Sometimes I work on grants that I can spend I need to spend some extra time thinking about it. And I also will work on poetry too. I do have a finished book of another finished chapter, which I just put on hold after when the pandemic started, and I just concentrated on these poems of others people, and it's been very rewarding. But it's delayed my own my own publication.
That is what I've found too that happens but it's so rewarding.
Yeah,
It is. Well, we do you have a poem of one of your favorite poets that you've been reading lately?
I I have so many favorite poets, and I think we were talking about Ross Gay was one of
Oh,
my
yeah.
recently favorite poets, but I think I loaned his book to somebody, so I don't have that one to read. So I thought I'd pick Bill Colm. He's also one of my favorite poets, and he's been very inspirational. Um, he and Billy Collins and Mary Oliver are ones that I've really studied so much that I felt I was learning something just from reading their stuff over and over again.
Mhm.
So this will kind of tie into the one that I first opened up with. Um, it's called Bird Poetry on Skagaford. That's Iceland. He's Icelandic, and he has a series of poems that he wrote in Iceland. And besides being beautiful poems, they made me want to go to Iceland, and I did. It was just wonderful. But anyway, here's the poem. Um, Seabirds arrange themselves into a sentence on the water. A crooked line of gulls and ducks bob into the slow tide for breakfast. Enough for everybody under here. They are spelling something, a message in white and gray, printed on blue textured paper. Much as I squint and mumble to myself, it still won't come clear. Every now and then, a letter or a whole syllable takes off into the air, rearranges itself in the dative place, or maybe a plural. It seems too certain to be subjunctive. The raven punctuates the sentence. This bird letter arrives for me to admire, but never understand.
Mhm. Oh,
Yeah,
well, do you have a 5 minute little poetry reading set aside for us?
yeah,
We do have one request from the chat. If you have your delayed chat book, if you happen to have a poem from the chat book that you haven't published yet,
yes.
somebody would love to hear one of those poems too.
Okay, that will be the last one I read.
Okay, cool.
Is that okay?
Yep.
I'll read you some from my first chapbook. Shy girls. Shy girls talk too loud in restaurants, stick their arms out straight to shake the hands of everyone they meet, think of all the things they should have said out loud, and cringe in shame remembering those they did. Shy girls wear too much makeup, pick the trumpet to play in fifth grade band, look for hidden meanings in everything they hear. Shy girls think their other girls are prettier, smarter, luckier, but no, they have something most girls can't match. Shy girls carry within their narrow chest the soul of a turtle, slow, persistent, persevering. Shy girls outlast the rest. Oh, I just got a note from Morgan Race. Wow, I remember her. She's a great poet too. I learned from her. Um, so that poem obviously tells you a little bit about me. Uh, and this next poem tells you a little bit about my upbringing. And it's called Before the Paris Shows. The length of this year's skirt was a subject of intense debate all winter. The women in my family paged through Vogue magazines, sifting gossip from fashion houses for clues. By the time the spring season arrived, names like Chanel, Dior, Givenchy were daily household words. Finally, the famous couturier spoke. This year, they decreed the hemline would be a daring 1 inch above the knee. Mannequins in department stores complied at once, flaunted clothes we could never afford to buy. From our closets, we gathered skirts and dresses, filled our sewing baskets with needle, thread, and scissors. All week long, we picked, folded, measured, basted, and pressed to finish hymns in place at the exact right length. We had such a desire to be fashionable, but despite all our work, they were still last year's clothes.
Mm.
So how much are we almost at the end now?
We've got 19 minutes to we're done.
Oh,
But we still have the giveaway to do.
okay. Well, this one's a little different. I had some of the poems in this book were called economic lessons. And this is economic lesson number 1 along the Northern Pacific Route. Trains, 100 freight cars long, travel through small Minnesota towns 50, 60 times a day, carrying coal, oil, and West Coast graffiti. Hanjin containers bound for New York, coal for the electric generation plants, shiny tank cars filled with black gold from the oil fields of North Dakota, where adventure beckons. Some towns have banned train whistles, but the wheels of the train on the cold metal tracks still whisper destiny to workers in the trackside factories, grain elevators, feed mills. In one town, a worker at the boatworks stops his hammering and listens. Destiny, destiny, say the train cars, clicking over the rails, heavy with profits, commanding respect. Each night at 3 a.m., the passenger train arrives. He imagines himself climbing aboard, his hand grasping the cold metal rail as he mounts the steps to the Pullman car. Minutes later, the train begins its slow creep, gathering momentum, wheels clacking, destiny, destiny, destiny.
Yes.
Winter roulette. Not just the first icy patch, but the second, the third, and so on. An accident on every one. A pickup truck spun out of control, hits the rock-hard snow of late winter, flips on its back like a surprised turtle. Shaker bodies emerge, wave away their would-be rescuers. Next, a yellow sports car overturned in the median between east and west lanes. Men form a silent circle around the wreckage. A police officer leads a woman away, face cupped in her hands. Impossible to tell which way they were heading. Now the only direction is back, to home, to hospital, or to dust. It's snowing again. By morning, the ditches will be unbroken white, ready for the next turn of the wheel. The time for the last poem?
That works.
Okay. This is the last poem in my new chapbook, which I haven't gotten around to getting published yet, but I will soon. It's called Final Words. If I had to choose a place for one final meal, I'd pick a small club with fewer than 20 tables, waiters who smile when they talk about the chef, a three-piece jazz combo playing old standards in the corner. If I have the chance for one more boat ride, I think it should be at evening in a canoe on a lake, with a breeze that barely ruffles the water and a loon calling his long, mournful cry in the distance. As I think about this, a fly, no bigger than a seed, lands in my cup and sinks as though he carries a great weight. Concerned he might drown, I stick in my thumb and lift him from my now tepid tea. Gossamer wings like silk fans are matted to his body. I watch him crawl from one side of my thumb to the other. When he reaches my nail, he scurries bravely across, and I, in order to keep his world right side up, rotate my hand as needed. At the callus where my pen usually rests, he stops, and taking his time, lifts one thin leg at a time, shakes a few fine droplets from each, then flicks his wings and flies away. And I think, if I have time for one more poem, perhaps I will write about falling in love.
Oh, that's,
Thank you very much for letting me do this. This has been a lot of fun.
I'm so happy. It's been great getting to know you. Julie, how is it, our contest going?
Okay, Morgan, Grace Willow, do you want to enter the contest? Enter a number in the chat between 1 and 50 for a chance to win a copy of Lina's chapbook. And after she enters, oh, I already have the chapbook too.
Oh, she already
Okay.
has it. Wow.
Okay, so I will announce our winners. Our winners are M.E. Fuller. I'm sorry, I don't remember what your name is on the screen. You are M.E. And maybe you already have a copy of it too. No, okay. And our other winner is Donna Isaac.
Oh,
Oh, thank you. I remember Dada from Poems of Hope and Reassurance.
well, and so both of you can send Lina a straight message, direct message to her with your address, and then she can send it to you.
Thank you.
Totally. Do we have any questions in the chat from anybody?
There, yes, from Morgan Grace Willow. She's asking Lina, she says, you saw the message where she is remembering you from New York Mills. And she's
Yes.
wondering if you're still doing photography.
Yes, I am. And now I have a cell phone, an Android, instead of my old Pentex. So I don't print as much. It's interesting enough, but I take a lot more photos because there's no trouble to take 50 or 60 photos of one shot.
And she's mentioning a photo in particular that she has of yours, of a collapsing old barn in winter.
Oh, really? That's my #1 bestseller. Everybody loves that one. I should write a poem about it.
And
Thank
here's
you.
another question that someone has put, that Donna has put in. Who are some of your other favorite poets and why?
I think so. Well, I read Bill Holm. He's one of my favorite, and Billy Collins is one of my favorite. It's their use of words are just, and the rhythm too. I'm not much of a scholar, in terms of this kind of poetry or this kind of poetry. I hear them all as songs in a way, and so I can really relate to that. But I also love Mary Oliver. Her work with nature and the way that she's so connected with that. It's reassuring even during the worst times to read something by Mary Oliver. And then I mentioned Ross Gay. He's my new best poet. He wrote one this last year called A Book of Delights, and he every day he decided he'd write something that was sort of delightful. And so what came to the ones that ended up as part of this book they're just great. And there's some are local, which is really fun because he grew up in Verndale, which is just down the road from Wadena. His mother was from there, so he knows would come back. They would come back and visit there. And he also has I've read a few of his poetry too, and a very interesting style that I might find myself emulating after a while, where he has very short sentences and deliberately. So, and that really has been one of the most difficult learning experience for me is where you actually break the line. So, what is Wadena like? Wadena is an old town that was founded actually before the Northern Pacific Railroad. And at that time, the town site of Watena was on the river. And as soon as the railroad came through, it moved to the railroad, to the tracks and built up along there. And then the railroad also started going, well, it goes from Minneapolis to Fargo and also north and south. Went like Park Rapids down to Fergusville. So there was this kind of this crossroads, and that line came a little bit later, and that went along the Jefferson. It was called Jefferson Street, and that's the old Jefferson Highway. That actually one of the first auto routes that goes from New Orleans clear up to Winnipeg. So it's this crossroads, and I think it's been by turns very active and then kind of quiet. It's now going through, I think, sort of an upswing. There's been a lot of, even during the pandemic, there's been new restaurants opened up. There's within the last couple of years, a brewery, a distillery, a wonderful German restaurant, and Mexican restaurant. So there's just a lot of things happening. I think it's a very good place for the arts. They have a very active, about 50-year-old called Mad Hatters theater group. And it's just it's a good place. I retired here when I sold my house, and I love it. I'm living right downtown in a historic building.
That picture, the picture that's oval on the wall behind you, the picture, that one. Yes,
Oh.
that's your wedding picture, isn't it?
That's my wedding picture. My last husband, the one I met here when I moved to Minnesota.
That's, is there any other questions? Are we?
There's no more questions.
Have one?
I was starting to write just a comment after your last poem, like, what is it with poets and flies? There are so many. I love your poem, and there just seems to be, like, that would be a fun collection, is poets and flies, because there are so many poets who have written their observation about flies. It's cool.
Sometimes that's a good way to get through life. You know, sometimes there are parts of life that are difficult to get through. And I found that the best way to do that is to really be observant. Sometimes during the toughest times of my life, I've just gone out and looked at a tree or a telephone pole. I mean, it doesn't matter what you look at. It's just the focus is taking it out off of yourself and really focusing on something outside yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's good.
You know, I think of you when you were 30 years old and you were in New York City and your girlfriends, and you were sitting there looking through that looking through that catalog, yeah, at how different the houses, the size of our buildings, our homes, and the land that we had, that you were looking at when you had such
very areas. You know, it was an era and where I think a lot of people were thinking about going back to the land, and a lot of people were thinking about getting out of the city, getting out of the rat race and stuff like that. And I'm sort of the kind of person that to think it is to do it. So there's a lot of people back in New York that are still saying that. still having those conversations.
Still saying that, and you went and lived it. Yes, definitely.
But it's a different life. It's totally different. I love New York. When I lived there, I had almost a romantic affection for the city. There's things that you could do in New York that you couldn't do out here, but there's things you could do out here you couldn't do in New York.
Definitely. Been back?
Lina,
Since-
you have a poem. I know Lina from, and she and I were in a online poetry
Yeah,
class together.
right.
That's how I met her. And then I went and met her in person and saw her beautiful museum quality house. And you have a poem. I feel like you have a poem about your husband restoring your radiators. And if it's not a poem, it's just the story of him lovingly restoring the radiators in your home. Is that a
Yeah,
poem?
I don't think I have it in this book here. No, I don't. And I can't remember it well enough to speak it without reading it. Sorry.
Can you just can you just tell us a little bit? I mean, I wish I could paint a picture for you all because I went to visit her. I went to her book launch, which was at Green Island Preserve, which if you haven't been there, that's a marvelous place.
Yeah.
And it's where she had poems of hope as well. But Lina had her own book launch, and then I went to visit Lina in this beautiful house that she and her husband had restored. And if you
Right.
can talk a little bit about those radiators, because Donna put in the chat, tell us about your husband. And I didn't meet your husband, but it just seemed like such a loving act to what he did to the radiators.
He repainted all they were the old radiators with layers of paint on them, and he took all the paint off of them and then he repainted them following all the designs. So they were beautiful. So in the one room, they were kind of orangey and gold, and in another room they were black and gold and stuff like that. And he banged on these radiators to get the paint off for months, and it was a cacophony of stuff like that. And I know what the poem you were talking about. After he died, I thought about taking stuff that I remembered of his, and in fact, I have done that in my apartment. I bring lots of memories with me, but the one thing I couldn't take was those radiators. I'll just have to remember that sound.
Well, I think that we have come to the end of our.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
I totally want to thank you for coming and spending time and introducing us, getting to know you. And I have to next month we have Jair. What's his last name?
Truer.
True.
Truer.
He is coming from Arizona, I believe.
Mhm.
So, and you know, Lina, here, I don't know, kind of in the beginning of the month, we have me and Julie have started this pop-up poetry spontaneous reading that we do mostly on a Saturday morning. We're open to do, and we're inviting everybody that are up close poets are welcome to join. So I will get when we do it in the beginning of January, I will make sure to get everybody a little bit more notice than I did last month.
Okay.
Which is like was hours or just one night.
Like you came up with the idea. You came up with the idea. Then
yeah, I'm like, whoa, I give nobody any time. So it was just me and Julie that did the pop-up little reading. But
thank you.
yes, totally.
Nice to see people, old friends, and nice to see some new ones. I haven't actually seen Donna yet, but I've seen her name there, so that's great.
Whoopsie, I almost did something bad.
Yeah.
Amazing. Sometimes
I got one address. I just wrote